Well, these armies right now, including, it says, the prince of the covenant or the leader of the covenant, Netanyahu, will he and Israel, will Hezbollah, Iran, and these armies be broken? None of them are talking about the desire for a Middle East dividing of the land right now. Is that going to change? And will the UN press upon them hard? And will that pushing and being shattered kind of produce that covenant that we've been waiting for that will launch the 70th week? I believe quite likely, yes. We're living at a very perilous time. And the reason I started with the parables was to create a sense of urgency upon those who are asleep. And the Bible really says a lot of folks are asleep. And in particular, the first parable dealt with those who lead and teach. And if you're a leader and a teacher, the imperative nature to put out food in due season, according to Matthew 24, and the urgent need to help your congregation watch. The word watch is huge. It just flashes huge right now with where we are. And I believe there is a close connection between watching and overcoming and helping folks to endure. And information and knowledge and understanding is linked in the book of Daniel to the theme of understanding. And so I believe it's going to be imperative for all of us to stay very, very prayerful, to stay very, very open to God teaching us. And the book of Daniel talks about how the prophetic word will be sealed, but then it'll be opened up in the end of time. And I believe that is where we are, is that prophecy is now becoming more and more unsealed as the day approaches and as people search to and fro in the Word of God, searching out its meaning and sharing. And I want to pick it up today right in the middle of God's prophetic word. And I'm motivated to try to help folks understand where I think we are and likely are moving in the days ahead in the very near future. And as I've said on, I think, both occasions so far, right now, the United Nations is, as it gathers and prepares to meet in October, it's going to meet at the end of September. I believe they start on September 22nd. And then 10 days later, on the Hebrew calendar, we have Tishri 1. And already, the UN has put in place a plan to divide the land of Israel, which will violate the teaching in Joel chapter 3, and 7 years later, bring on Armageddon. And so we have some very solid, objective things to look at. And what we're watching for is Daniel 9:27, and the intersection of Daniel 9:27 with the white horse rider in Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. Are these events coming together? And as I've said before, Revelation chapter 6 is really a continuation and a parallel with Matthew 24. And the events in Revelation 6 harmonize. There's 13 different prophetic events that are cited in Matthew 24 and also in Revelation 6, all the way through the chapter, right in through chapter 7 and the first part of chapter 8. And going back to the big question that I would pose right now for us to ponder, as the United Nations moves and comes together this fall, will they be fulfilling Daniel 9:27? And I'll just go ahead and read it. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. And in particular, just the first part of that, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. And I'm in agreement, complete agreement with most prophecy teachers that this will be the final week of Daniel's 70 weeks as it comes together. This is the week that will end history with the return of Christ. And with that in mind, we ask the question, is this coming together in the very near future? We would be just less than 2 months out from this event happening. Are the events that are happening right now setting us up for that? Is the war in the Middle East, which began with Hamas on October 7th and is now moving into a new phase, quite possibly, where Hezbollah and Iran may expand it? And the question everybody's asking is, what will Israel do? And with the presidential race in the United States and Kamala Harris coming on board, and with Tim Walz coming on board, both very hostile to Israel, what is the significance of that in the coming days, and how will that push events? As we pick it up in Revelation 6, verse 2, I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. So will this writer soon be writing? And what is he all about? And how does he fit? Will he come at a time that triggers the 70th week? I believe he will. And I think I'm in agreement with most prophecy teachers here. And this will initiate the 70th week. And in the book of Matthew, Jesus warns us in verse 4, as he's talking about and answering the question, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Jesus answers and says to them, see to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. So we have that warning right off the bat, and really a command not to be misled. And that will correspond perfectly with the rider on the white horse. The horse he'll be sitting on has a bow with no arrows. And really that signifies to most prophecy teachers that this represents a covenant. A bow was a covenant back in Genesis chapter 9 with the rainbow covenant that was fulfilled after the flood, and points ahead to another covenant that is soon coming. And it'll be a covenant of peace, but it'll be a false peace that'll be coming on the earth. And a crown was given to him. And this crown is the Stephanos crown. And interestingly, both that white and the Stephanos crown are represented at the UN. That is what's so intriguing right now, is that the UN seems to fulfill the symbolism that's being represented here in Revelation 6:2. The symbol of, whiteness and a bow and peace, a false peace, that is going to soon be coming on display. And this Stephanos crown that will represent a false peace. And then it says he'll go out conquering and to conquer, this rider on the white horse. And it's going to be a false peace that will be taken to the world, which the world will embrace. And as I raise that question, are we now headed rapidly in that direction? What events are happening right now that are pushing that along? And I believe what's happening in the Middle East is exactly pushing us along those lines. And I'm going to refer now to a chapter that I have found most amazing, that I think gives us probably the most detailed timeline that shows where events are moving. And it's in Daniel chapter 11. And I pick it up in verse 21. In Daniel chapter 11, verses 21 all the way through the end of the chapter, I believe gives us a detailed account of the 70th week. And I'm going to start in verse 21 because there's a break between 20 and 21. And we have And then most people recognize this break, but we have a new character, and in his place a despicable person will arise. Now, historians and prophecy teachers generally teach this to be Antiochus Epiphanes, who comes on in the 2nd century before Christ. But I believe you can make a strong case that everything in this chapter, 21 through 45, yes, it's a type of the Antichrist, but I believe it's more than that. The type is really going to be completely fulfilled by the coming Antichrist. And so that's an interesting interpretation to ponder. If I go to verse 31, we get the abomination of desolation. The abomination is spoken of in 4 places in the book of Daniel. And Jesus, of course, referred to this in chapter 24, Matthew 24, verse 15. And he talked about when you see the abomination of desolation. And then he said, go to Daniel. And that's what we need to do, is to go to the 4 places in Daniel that speak of the abomination of desolation. So that means if I go to Daniel in verse 31, that puts us at the midpoint, according to Daniel 9:27. It says he'll make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. That week refers to a 7-year period on the Jewish calendar coming out of Leviticus 25. And we know this from the book of Jubilees, exactly how they kept their calendars. And the year began on Tishri 1, again, which is where the United Nations is meeting. Then it says, but in the middle of the week, at the midpoint, he'll put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And so we know at the middle of the week is verse 31, where it says, forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifices, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. So that would put us at the midpoint. A lot of prophecy teachers believe Antiochus Epiphanes takes us all the way through verse 35. And then in verse 36, we have a perfect parallel with 2 Thessalonians 2. But I believe you can just work your way back from Daniel 11:36 and go all the way back through the chapter and just follow what's called following the antecedent. And you follow the pronoun he. So you start with going all the way to verse 45 and the word he, which is the Antichrist, and we know that from verse 36. And we just trace it backwards all the way through the chapter, and I'll let you do this on your own, and follow the antecedent. It will take us, of course, to verse 31, where we deal with forces from him, and just keep working our way back. And we're going through the first 3.5 years here of, I believe, the 7-year period, that final week. And it'll take us back to verse 31, where it says, forces from him will arise, desecrate, that's verse 31. I'm going to go back to verse 21. In his place, a despicable person will arise. And if I'm accurate here, what we have is an account of the rise of Antichrist. And what's really intriguing to me as I begin to work forward, I can get a little window into where we are right now. And it's fascinating. So let me just kind of walk you through how this looks. In his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. But he will come, and this is the New American Standard, it says, in a time of tranquility, and seize the kingdom by intrigue. So verse 21, I believe, is close to where we are right now. If we look at the rise of the Antichrist, I believe he's already here. He hasn't made a public witness testimony yet, and we may not even know who he is exactly until the midpoint, because Jesus says, when you see the abomination. And so when we see that event, that'll be a massive red flag that events have really taken place. But I believe we can have a lot of objective criteria. For example, Tishri 1 corresponding to a covenant. There's a couple of objective criteria that says to us, We have launched into the 70th week. And with that, we should see a temple going up. We should see sacrifices being offered. And a lot of scripture beginning to really converge at that point in time that will just shout that we're in the 70th week. And having said that, I think it behooves all of us to stay open to God teaching us and to maybe even correcting some of our theology. As the book of Daniel said, as the day approaches, there will be an unsealing. And I believe that's happening right now. So moving back to Daniel chapter 11, we have this despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. I believe that's quite likely the little horn of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, who's going to rise inconspicuously, not well known, and not having a kingship placed upon him. Now that was true of Antiochus Epiphanes, who kind of fought his way up and assassinated people that got in his way. This fellow, I believe, the Antichrist, is going to arise in a bit of obscurity. And the New American Standard says he'll come in a time of tranquility. Now, as I look at that phrase, a time of tranquility, I want to compare what some of the other translations will say. The Septuagint translation says he'll come in a time of prosperity and shall prevail. The American Standard Version says he shall come in a time of security. The ESV says he'll come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. I believe this person, I tend to go with what the ESV is saying here, as interpreters kind of struggle to put these passages together and look at a person who's going to come in kind of out of nowhere without warning and suddenly emerge. But the emergence is going to be slow and gradual, I believe, in a sense. Now, going back to the New American Standard, I'm going to pick it up in verse 21 and continue to walk through it. And he'll seize the kingdom by intrigue. Now, that word intrigue is kind of interesting. And if I look at Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 9, I can correspond this and see, well, what's the rise of Antichrist going to be all about? And I'm going to circle back to Daniel chapter 8 and just play around with this notion of intrigue and see if I can pick up some more clues as to the rise of the Antichrist. And in Daniel 8, verse 9, it says, out of one of them came forth a rather small horn. There again is that rise of this despicable person. And this small horn will grow exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. There's kind of a big picture view of movement that will soon happen. And he'll be coming on the scene. And I'm going to drop it down to get some more explanation on this notion of intrigue to verse 23, where it says, in the latter period of their rule, and it's picking up, and here's the explanation of what went before. When the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue, and his power be mighty, but not by his own power. And it's like, I look at that, and I'm going, this person that's already here is going to rise up. His character is insolent, and he's skilled in intrigue. And I believe this person is already here. And he comes in without warning in verse 21, and he'll seize the kingdom by intrigue. Now here's a passage in verse 22 that I have to tell you, I've been pondering Daniel 11:22 for about 10 years. It says, the overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. I pondered that for years, and I just did not know what to do with that. And then continuing on, verse 23, it says, after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. And we had a group that was studying this, and we had different ideas on what this could mean. And I must admit, I was a little slow to come around to the understanding I had now. A lot of others were way ahead of me. But where I'm at now is when I look at the rise of the Antichrist right here in 21, and then in 22, the overflowing forces will be flooded away before him. I want to do, again, a little bit of comparison on what's going on here. And it says in the ESV, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. Well, that intrigued me. So we have the rise of this Antichrist person, and now we have an outbreak of war. And the word for armies is plural. Overflowing forces, armies flooded away. So there's going to be warfare, and they're going to be shattered. And it says before him, and I wonder, is Antichrist, who I believe will come out of Syria, Turkey, right in that area, flowing right out of Daniel chapter 8. And I would highly recommend Joel Richardson's work on Mideast peace and the coming Islamic Antichrist to give you some food for thought to ponder. Have we been off base in our notion that Antichrist will come out of Europe based on Daniel 9:26, the people of the prince who will come? He does a great work there. So there's a lot of shifting, I think, in the prophecy world, and Joel, I believe, has made a great contribution. So as I look at this right now, and the warfare that's going on with Hezbollah and Iran and Israel, is this event talking about that? Because in verse 23, we have an alliance. Does that correspond to a covenant? It's a different word. It's a different Greek or a Hebrew word than covenant. And we'll take a look at that. But it says, after an alliance is made with him, he'll practice deception. So does this war right now lead to this alliance that's spoken of in verse 23? In other words, what's happening in the Middle East right now, is that the trigger event? Are we getting set up for Daniel's 70th week, which the UN has already drafted and would press Israel? I'm going to go back to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and kind of raise that back up and take a look at a word right now that I think is very important. In Daniel 9:27, it says he'll make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. And that word make is a very important word. It says he will confirm. The word is gabar, and it carries notions of force. And right now what we're looking at is the United Nations and global powers pressing on Israel, and Israel increasingly being pressed upon as we move forward to October 2nd. Will they increasingly be pressed upon? Well, right now they're standing pretty firm, saying they will not go for a two-state solution. The United States is pressing really hard, and we have a bit of control because they rely upon us for support and a lot of arms. And they've made themselves dependent, and we've kept them in that dependency zone purposefully for a control factor. So the United States is pressing hard right now, and in many ways hindering the war effort for Israel in the Middle East. And so we have these armies, and then it says they're going to be shattered, or some of the translations say broken. And I'm asking myself, what's going to happen in the Middle East? Will these armies right now, including, it says, the prince of the covenant, or the leader of the covenant, Netanyahu, will he and Israel, will Hezbollah, Iran, and these armies be broken? None of them are talking about the desire for a Middle East dividing of the land right now. Is that going to change? And will the UN press upon them hard? And will that pushing and being shattered kind of produce that covenant that we've been waiting for that will launch the 70th week? I believe quite likely, yes.